as I indicated early along, I've been very interested in this whole topic of targets, camera profiling, imaging performance, and so on and so forth, as well as how it intermixes with standards. So Arnab is diving into this a little bit today. The merits, use, and limitations of standards like FADGI. So I hope this spurs a lot of inspirational conversations for everybody to kind of scratch their heads a little bit and think about stuff some more. To give a little bit more about Arnab, Arnab is the head of product management at Digital Transitions. He does a bit more than that, but he's just a tremendously smart guy. He has a bachelor's degree in biomedical engineering from Duke, passion for photographic processes, both analog and digital, and he works to develop solutions for photography in the culture, in the heritage communities at this point. So Arnab, I'm gonna give you the mic, the presentation space, and let's go.
Excellent. Thank you, Pete, for that kind introduction. Just so you guys know, I'm the one thing standing between you and lunchtime. So I'm going to try and keep this fun and interactive. This presentation I've been wanting to give for a while. We're going to get a little bit controversial. We're going to talk a little bit about the limitations of FADGI, Metamorfoze, and ISO, but also why they're absolutely critical for everything that we do in heritage imaging. All right. So I want to kick some things off the presentation with some poll questions. I want to get a little bit of an idea about what everybody's comfort level in the audience is. Carson, I'm going to do these poll questions myself, so I should be able to do this. Number one, do you know what FADGI is? All right. I assume that most folks do, but for those of you that don't, please let me know, because I want to make sure that this is accessible to all levels. For those of you that, of course, know what FADGI is, it's not going to be super basic. I think that there will be some things that you get out of it, but yeah, I mean, so we can see that roughly 5-6% of the audience is not familiar with FADGI. So we'll talk a little bit about what FADGI is. The next question that I have here is, have you ever referenced the tables in the FADGI documentation? So this is pages 18 through 51. The things that tell you, if you want to get 4-star level for bound material, you got to have this set of specs. If you want to get 2-star for transmissive material, you got to hit these specs, so on and so forth. Okay, so we've got about a 75-25 split here, 70-30. That's great. That's what I kind of expected. It would be a little bit lower. Now, here's an interesting one, all right? And I'm curious to see what the results will be to this one. Have you read the introduction to FADGI? So this is before those tables, page 18 and before. This is the stuff that talks about the scope and the reasoning for FADGI and kind of what the motivation was for creating it and why. So again, we're getting pretty much the same. This is good. You guys have done your homework, about 70-30 split here, okay? Now, the last question, and sorry, I forgot to flip through the slides here. Have you ever had to depart from strict compliance with FADGI to achieve your imaging goal in a certain case? And I'm going to wait a second before I put this up, because I want you to think before you put a knee-jerk kind of reaction that's like, oh my God, of course I did, FADGI results. Have you ever taken an image of something with, you set up your system perfectly, right, with your target, and then looked at it and said, this doesn't really represent exactly what the thing looks like, right? So I'm going to share that now. Please go ahead and, oh, wonderful, perfect. Okay, good. So I was hopefully expecting that a good number of you were going to answer yes. We're about 90-10, 85-15. So this is looking good, okay? I think a lot of you are going to understand what I mean by this, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more in detail, why this is. This is where things get, a little controversial. FADGI is, the G stands for guidelines. We'll get to that in a second. And guidelines are not laws, right? There is a big difference between those two things. And we'll talk a little bit about, where strict compliance is important and where guidelines are guidelines, where they're best practices, but we may need to kind of, adapt from those. So here's my goal for today, all right? I want you, when you're doing these imaging projects, when you're planning a digitization project, to stop and think about your goals. Before you look at your FADGI guidelines, before you calibrate your system, before you start shooting, I want you to think about why you're making these images. I want you to think about your audience, who you're making these images for, right? Because there's a very important, difference between what an image scientist wants to see and what, your board of directors or your clients might want to see. Where these images are going, right? An image is going on Instagram versus going to a government, repository. There are going to be differences in what you need to do, right? You can always down res things, right? You can't necessarily up res things and still pass, but sometimes, even if you're able to hit FADGI 4-star on a system, you might not need to, right? And the last thing here is how these images will be used, right? So are these things that we're using to, represent these images to researchers? Or maybe are these things that we're using to try and sell a painting? If we're working at a gallery or, doing something, are we trying to make it look, really pretty, right? What I want you to stop thinking is FADGI, right? FADGI is, I think this is the slide, right? Federal Agency Digitization Guidelines Initiative. It is not, the G doesn't stand for, God will smite you if you don't do these things, okay? So again, when we look at these definitions, and I'm focusing mostly on FADGI today, the general guidelines that we're talking about here, the general principles, will also apply, of course, to Metamorfoze, to ISO 19264, any sort of set of standards that you've got going on. The specifics, the numbers might be a little bit different, but the general concepts are the same. If you look at the introduction to FADGI, and this is why I asked if people have read that introduction, it says, and I quote, "The guidelines are intended to be informative, not prescriptive." And so what that means is that this stuff is educational. This stuff is a set of best practices that's going to give you a good, measurable way to quantify your image quality. But it's not something that is prescriptive, that you have to do, that you have to follow, right? So an anonymous color scientist who may or may not be in this call right now, or this seminar right now, described FADGI as something that is supposed to be helpful, not handcuffs. All right. So it's something that's designed as a series of best practices, a series of recommendations, not something that is supposed to hold you back from creating images. Okay. So what I am not saying is that we don't need guidelines. We absolutely need guidelines, and I want to talk about some of the reasons why we do absolutely need these guidelines. So one of the first things that we try to achieve with guidelines is creating an unbiased ruler, right? So something that we can use to measure, anywhere in the world with any, system. So, between different systems, if I have a scanner, if I have a camera-based system, if I have somebody doing courtroom sketches, I can use those to evaluate things, right? That's going to be like FADGI negative star levels, but we can measure between these systems, right? And we can also measure sort of longitudinally, right? So within our own system over time, if I take an image today and I take an image a year from now, right, on my same system, I can get an idea of whether my system has stood the test of time or if it's drifting, in performance. And that's a very important thing to be able to do, right? So creating that ruler, creating that standardized system is one of the most important things that these guidelines, whether they're FADGI, Metamorfoze, ISO, or something else, is going to be there for. Another thing here is it enables us to comprehensively set expectations for images. And what I mean by this is if I take an image and I send it to you and I say, man, or whoever, this is the best image I've ever made. It's really great. It's really good. You don't really know what that means, right? Does that mean that this is like the prettiest image I've ever made? Does it mean that this is the most color accurate image that I've ever made? Or maybe I'm not a very good photographer, and that doesn't really mean anything if it's the best image that I've ever made. And I'm not going to say that I am or am not, but you probably know which one of those it is. So what this does is if I send an image to you and say this conforms to FADGI 4-star, there is no doubt as to what the color accuracy is, right, within certain tolerances, what the resolution, what the reproduction scale is, how large that material actually is, what the tonal response of that image is, right? So it doesn't matter what system I shot it on, doesn't matter if I shot it, a couple of years ago, there's no doubt as to what that means in terms of what the image quality is, and more importantly, what I can glean from that image and be sure that that is accurate, right? Is this an image I can use for metrology? Or is this an image that maybe I can just use for getting an idea of what this thing roughly looks like? This is a great example of why we need standards, right? If I'm looking for the Mona Lisa, right, I can look it up online, and you'll see that these are wildly different images in terms of tone, color, the crop, the resolution. If you know the two Mona Lisa theory, there are actually some of these that are not the Mona Lisa that is the one that we usually think, the one that we actually use or think of as the one in the museum. So yeah, we got to have an idea of whether this is something that we can create on Google Images or see on Instagram, or if this is something that we can use for research purposes, right? The less fun reason for why we need to have standards is catching cheaters, right? So, they were created by the government. The government has so much stuff that they can't possibly image it all in-house. And they need a way of ensuring that the quality of the images that are created by contractors is actually good, okay? This is an incredible image from one of our former employees, Rudy Lorejo, who hopefully some of you guys know. He graciously gave me the permission to use this image. Sloppy setups, are going to create images that maybe don't conform to standards, but you might be able to get away with it if there's no verification of standards. Things like upsampling, whether it's bit depth or resolution, that is not kosher. That's not something that we want to allow, right? Interpolating badly, if we have a scanner, if we have a digital camera that's not, doing proper interpolation for resolution or color purposes, and fixing things digitally. So, if you're trying to take out dust spots on film, virtually, or, resizing, keystoning, whatever, you don't want to do that. You want to get it right in camera. You want to clean things right. You want to orient things right, align things properly. You want to do it optically, right? That said, if you look at this setup, the actual image that came off of that slide was this image right here, right? And I want you to think about goals, right? We were talking about using these standards as a means of achieving our goals. Rudy's goal here was to take a goofy picture and be able to post it on Instagram. And he achieved that. He absolutely did. That was his goal, right? He could have waited, a couple of days, gone into the DT office, shot this, FADGI 4-star quality, on his system. But that's not what he needed to do. So he was able to do it, just taping an iPad and getting a, his Canon and shooting it, right? And achieved his goal. So let's get a little bit more into, the what you guys are going to be doing, potentially in your heritage setups, right? So what I want to do today is I want to make a standard. We're going to just kind of create together a standard from the ground up. So for those of you that are not familiar with FADGI or where it currently is, this is going to be hopefully a great illustration of what it is, why it's there, and how it was made. So again, the first thing, and you're going to see this so many times throughout this presentation, and again, I want this to be your takeaway, is you need to set a goal, right? So for our standard, I'm going to propose that our goal is preservation grade imaging. And what I mean by that is this little mission statement here. I want to create a digital image that faithfully reproduces the original material such that having access to that image is as closely informative as having access to the original within the limitations of the technology available, right? So 2D image is never going to be the same as looking at the actual thing, but we want it to be as informative as possible. That said, we also need to create that unbiased ruler. We need to have key quantifiable metrics that we can take and make numerical analysis of and provide an unbiased comparison of how well our image performs. So we need to pick metrics that images that fit our goals are going to excel at, they're going to perform well at, and things that images that are not so good will score poorly on. So we can get that kind of resolution. And when we take these metrics and we pick what we want to measure, we need to make sure that there is no room for misinterpretation on how we measure these metrics. So today I want to pick 3 key things that I think are very important to image quality: tone response, color accuracy, and resolution. So how good your reproduction of kind of like the grayscale or the luminance across an image is, how accurate your color is to the original, and how good your detail is in your image. And each of those has an ISO document, an entire document dedicated to how those things are measured. So tone response is measured in something called OECF, which is, again, there's a whole 100-page document on how you measure this. If there is any doubt as to how you should be measuring this, I can say, look at that documentation and it will tell you exactly what you need to do. Color is through delta E, resolution is through something called SFR. We don't need to worry too much about what those things are, but we have these metrics that we have laid out so that we have reference for these things and there's no room for misinterpretation. Whether I'm here in the US doing it on a camera system or somebody is across the world, in Japan doing this on a scanner, we have those same metrics and we have the same way of measuring those, so we can do an apples to apples comparison. The third thing I need to do is decide on tolerances, right? So we saw in the FADGI guidelines and also in Don's presentation of Golden Thread NXT that there are multiple levels and multiple kind of corridors of if you fit this closely, right, you're 4-star. If you're within a little bit more wide of a range, maybe you're 3-star. If you're here 2-star, and if you're this far, maybe you're 1-star or failing, right? So generally these are in terms of ranges around a target or reference value, right? And if we look at FADGI for unbound manuscripts, so basically pieces of paper, the tone response is defined, for 4-star as plus or minus 2 levels from the target value. For color, you have to be within plus minus 3 delta E from the target value. And for resolution, that should say 90% of the target value, for your PPI, right? Now we keep saying, of the target value, from the target value. What is that target value that we're measuring? What are we comparing this to? This is something that I want to really point out in terms of, the fact that FADGI, Metamorfoze, ISO, they don't tell us what those target values are, right? Those are determined based on the target that we use. They tell us what the tolerance around that target value is. And that's why it's so important that our reference values, our target values, are individually measured and stay accurate over time. So like, Dave showed us, if we get Cheeto dust all over our stuff, we got to make sure we clean it and remeasure it or throw it out and get a new target, because we might get results that say, you're wildly off when actually you're not. Your reference value is just not consistent with what your target is, right? So we get these target values and these reference values from targets, right? And we use a spectrophotometer, just like the one Dave used to measure the variance in the targets. And we get a little document that's going to tell us this is our grayscale reference and this is our color reference. So, we'll talk about how we get the resolution reference in a little bit. But this is something, and Peter mentioned that we have had some clients that have really pushed us, right, on color accuracy and hitting, or I'm sorry, not color accuracy, but tonal accuracy, and to some extent color accuracy, and reproduction of hitting those target values to make sure that we're nailing FADGI 4-star. There's nothing wrong with that, and we absolutely should be able to do that. But the way that these spectrophotometers work, and as Dave pointed out, is they have this 45-0 configuration, which means that they've got these little point sources on the edge. They shoot down at a 45-degree angle onto the little patch, right? And then the light comes up at a very, and is measured at a very narrow angle by the receiver, all right? What we try and do when we build our system is create something that's very similar, right? And so you'll notice there are a lot of similarities between this and the DT atom, right? We have our lights coming in from the side at some angle, which, as some of you know, is not 45 degrees, right? The angle of the lights is not 45 degrees, and this has caused a lot of confusion, and I'll clear that up hopefully in just a second. But then it bounces up right into a little, receiver, which is your camera. That said, the angle of the light, when you have these sources that have an area, right, they're not just point sources, is not equivalent to your angle of illumination. You actually have different angles coming in, right? Some are less than 45, some are more than 45, because you're not using a point source, and you don't want to be using a point source because you just wouldn't be able to get proper illumination with that. But if you look at this, for each of those points, not only are you going at a certain angle when you're going straight down to the edges of the system, but you're also getting multiple angles coming out from that point because it radiates out at a certain angle. Now, the ideal system to create the measurements that would perfectly reproduce, in theory, the spectrophotometer would be a source that is infinitely small and infinitely far away, okay? And as a result, it would probably have to be infinitely bright too to actually, reach our target. If any of you know of a light source that fits those standards, please let me know, because I would like to sell it to the government and make some cash on the side. That would be great. Now, as product manager, I would, if I could, design the system, and I love you guys so much that I would take that light and I would walk to infinity and I would put it there. The problem is that we need more than one light, and I don't have time to walk to infinity and then back twice, okay? So I would do it once for you guys, but I just can't get it done twice, and I apologize for that. So we are gonna have some ways that we work around that. We're gonna use it by using a high quality system for our hardware and our software. We're gonna have uniformity corrections through our LCCs. We're gonna create good color profiles from our targets. We're going to make sure that we're using those targets correctly, right? So we have good reference data, we have them in the right spot when we're measuring them. And we're going to make sure that we have a well-controlled environment, right? So vibration, masking off light that is sort of stray. So we're getting the right contrast and the right color. And with this stuff, we should, can and should be able to match those reference values within those tolerances, okay? I want to now go to talking about resolution, okay? The way that this is done is through slanted edge analysis. So you'll see these little kind of squares that are off axis on the target. And what that lets us do is it shows the, pixels per inch and lets us measure that and see what the actual optical response is. So I can set my camera to, 4,000 pixels per inch, but I may not actually be resolving that high because of diffraction, because of, softness in the image, right? There may be any number of reasons why I'm not getting the proper PPI, and so I will get a percentage of the target that I'm getting, all right? So I've got 5 minutes left here. I'm gonna kind of go through this real quick. Here I've got some 35 millimeter film that I shot on the system. And 35 millimeter film, if you're trying to hit FADGI 4-star, you need to get it to 4,000 PPI plus or minus 10%, right? So the software, if I'm looking at this image and analyzing it, might say that I'm 95% efficient. FADGI says that passes. That means we're all set. If I take this and I sharpen the crap out of it, I might actually get that above 100%. That means I'm cheating, right? And so FADGI is going to say that that fails, right? It says 90%, but it also has to be less than 100%. Okay, so this is part of where those standards will help you catch cheaters. Now, what if I get less than 90%? All right, if I get 75%, I'm going to fail. And that means that something is not quite right optically. It may be vibration, it might be misalignment, it might be any number of things. But it doesn't mean that everything is completely garbage. It just means I need to look at my system and figure out what is not quite right, right? So the key takeaway here is I want you to start with standards, but also use your head. And because we're working with images, particularly your eyes, right? Some common sense. And remember, this is about goals. We're here to create images that solve problems, right? Not just check boxes. And now I want to quickly cover a couple of ridiculous examples and then some real examples here. So this is a golden fed target, and I apologize, Don, for what I'm about to do to this thing. You see the target values are printed on there, and we are within that 2 points. We're just looking at the grayscale here, so I've taken out the color. And this is a good image, right? This is a good, proper reproduction of this target. Now, because we're looking at a discrete number of points, right? If I hit those points, but I miss everything else, I might still be able to hit FADGI 4. So I gave it a shot. I locked down the value for each of those points, and you'll see the red is kind of roughly the corridor, right? And then I took things between those and just absolutely massacred that curve. The result is this image. But if you look at those values, they are all within 2 points. This image for luminance only, right? And there are other things in FADGI that would make this fail. But for luminance only, I have nailed this, right? This image is technically perfect from that standpoint. So this is an example of where common sense, you look at this thing, you're like, this image is garbage. This is not right. But technically, those numbers are within that tolerance. Now let's take a look at some more, and here's a side-by-side comparison. But let's take a look at some more realistic examples. So here's a case where we had a client come to us, aerial film, and they need to be able to make measurements, right, on this film within a certain number of microns. They're less worried about how pretty the image looks and more concerned with how good and accurate the measurements that they make on that film are going to correspond to the real world. All right. So they're saying, please hit 10,000 PPI. All right. So we set our camera to 10,000 PPI because of some, just general performance things, right? At that, once you're at high magnification, you're going to get a lower sampling efficiency. We hit 85%, and FADGI would say that that fails. So, or fails, right? Now, if you look at what we actually got, right, 85% of 10,000, 8,500. And so according to client specs, we absolutely failed too. So what did we do? We upped that camera system to 13,000 PPI setup. And our efficiency actually dropped even further. We got 80%. So FADGI would say, you absolutely failed again. But 80% of that 13,000 puts us at 11,050 PPI. So we actually passed the client standard for that. All right. This next example is one of my favorites here. So I may cut a little bit into the presentation, into the question and answer time, but I do want to cover these, and we won't cut too far. But if you're shooting numismatics, so the instruments of money, right? And you're shooting coins, you're going to get specular highlights all day, every day. And this image is from Creative Commons, and it's a terrible image, right? And this is a perfect example of why this is hard. You're getting specular highlights all day, every day. Right? So if I take this and I shoot it with balanced 45-degree light, right, I'm going to get an image like this that's got some hot specular highlights. It's not really telling me a lot about the texture of that coin. And you'll see that I have a little color picker there that I've normalized the measurements that are going to follow. If I take some raking light from 3 o'clock, so I bring my light down and I just have it coming from one side, look at that texture. Right? I'm not getting those crazy specular highlights, and I'm getting some nice revealing textures on that. If I move it around to 12 o'clock, I actually can see some different defects in that coin, right? So back, forth, back, and forth. You'll note that I normalized again to that little pad in the background. So this is an example of where it may not make sense to work from that balanced 45-0 angle. I'm going to finish up. There are plenty of other examples of where you're going to need to just totally change things. If you're working at a baseball card museum, which is a real thing, right? And you have a holographic card, that thing is literally designed to look different from different angles. And so that would be a nightmare to image, and you'd have to figure out a way to do that. If you're doing textiles, the weave, the pattern is incredibly important. right? And so that's going to be a critical part of the imaging that you're going to be doing. And God forbid you do something like stained glass, you've got to figure out a way to adapt to that, right? And remember, that's just flat art. So FADGI doesn't even cover 3D objects like sculptures, bees, right? There's no page about bees, right? And decorative arts, right? Vases or furniture. Composite models like spectral imaging, RTI, photogrammetry, anyone that's going to the 2D, 3D conference will know about this. And fluorescent objects or art that contains light sources. There are plenty of things these days in modern art museums that use neon tubes or lights and things like that. So if you only take one thing away, I want it to be start with standards, use your head, use your eyes, because we're here to set goals and achieve those goals that solve problems and not just check boxes. Okay. That's all I've got. If you want to go to questions, I know we have a little bit less time, and then we can go to more in the breakout session. But Pete, if you want to get those started, so we.
Sure, I'm ready. Arnab, thank you for a very provocative conversation. So I'm waiting for the first question to pop up.
Yeah. What do you guys got? Hit me.
It did pop up for a second and disappeared. Here's one question that came up. How do the FADGI guidelines differ from those of Metamorfoze?
That's a good question. So
and that question is from Greg.
Yeah, so there are different levels, right? So FADGI has 1 through 4 star. Metamorphose has 3 levels. So there's light, I think like medium and strict. They have different specific tolerances. There are certain measurements, those key metrics that are part of FADGI, and different measurements that are part of Metamorphose. Many are similar, but some are not there. In general, and this may be again controversial, FADGI is harder to hit than Metamorphose. Yeah, so there are plenty of differences. If you want to look at the documentation, I don't have all of those memorized, but we can definitely talk about that in the breakout session.
Okay. Let's see, we have another question pop up.
I mean, look, if this presentation was so clear that nobody has any questions, I'm cool with that too.
So one thing that always strikes me about these conversations about standards and so forth, that they're don't take into account descriptive lighting versus even lighting.
Exactly. Yeah. So I see a question there.
Yeah. This is from Dan. What sort of quality objectives does DT use, FADGI or something else?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, we typically use FADGI because that's what most of our clients are using. That said, our systems are designed to be able to hit, Metamorphose as well. Again, Metamorphose is a little less strict, even though the highest level is called strict, than FADGI. And, with sort of the rise of ISO 19264 and the new target that Don has out, it's a priority for us to be able to hit that too. And again, as product manager, if you have suggestions, if you have questions, concerns, this, that, and the other, about our systems, whether they're from a technical standpoint, an ergonomic standpoint, whatever it might be, that's the kind of stuff that we want to hear. As Pete pointed out earlier, part of the reason that we're giving this presentation and that we're concerned with these angle of illumination things and these resolution measurements is because our clients have pushed us to really look at those and make sure that we can hit those in a comprehensive way. And that's a priority, right? That's the kind of stuff that gives us, an idea of what we need to improve on.
Now, why don't you answer that question a little bit from the perspective of Pixel Acuity as well, since we're pretty, tied together.
Absolutely.
On our approach to these things.
Yeah. So the team at PA, again, they understand that goals are super important. So, part of that initial conversation that you'll have if you're working with Pixel Acuity is, what are you trying to do with these images, right? Sometimes there are galleries, there are individual, private collectors that just want really nice looking images so that they can sell them, put them on a website, show them to their other rich friends, whatever it might be. And if that's what you're looking for, we'll discuss how to do that, right? If you're looking for FADGI compliance, we will absolutely do that as well, or ISO or Metamorfoze. That's part of that initial consultation and the sort of bespoke services that they provide. So, it's not one standard. Again, it's about that idea of what is the goal that you're trying to achieve with those images. And so that in general, working with the folks at Pixel has been the really, driving force behind what standards that we use and what practices we use to achieve, those results.
Yeah, I mean, part of the way I think about it too, Arnab, is like a production facility. If you're in a factory, you want to ensure that whatever you're making is very consistent. Standards are crucial, aside from the equipment. However, sometimes you can use cake making for an example, right?
Yeah.
So if you're Entenmann's or another cake manufacturer or whatever it is, you want to have a very consistent product day to day, week to week, year to year, factory to factory. However, if you're a master cake baker or cake maker, you may want to deviate a bit depending on what the client wants.
Exactly. Yeah. And real quick, I do want to point out, I've seen Tani Cacciola from Getty making a couple of comments in here. And Tani and I believe Kevin Kenland from the San Francisco Museum of Asian Art did a ridiculously good presentation on descriptive lighting and shooting 3D presentations. It was just fabulous, and it explains a lot of the reasoning behind maybe deviating from these. I mean, there's no 3D standards in FADGI, but what descriptive lighting is and sort of working towards your goal and creating, images that fit those things are. So I would highly suggest watching that presentation, and
Yep.
hopefully someone can throw a link in the chat for that.
That's an excellent point. So let's. All right, let's go back to the previous question from Kevin. He brought up a good point about deviating from the standards, and honestly, this is a little out of scope for us to discuss. I mean, I know we deviate depending on the client's needs. I do think that should be a question brought up in the community itself. When is it a good time to leave FADGI, Metamorfoze, or the ISO standard? But that's not really for us to answer. All right, the next one's from Laura. What standards do you suggest institutions with mixed collections, 2D and 3D use? Is there something that can be applied universally, or is it just a dream?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. And I think the presentation that Tani and Kevin gave is a great sort of testament to the fact that it's kind of got to be based on the goals, right, that you have. In general, it's hard to say that there's a universal application, right? Because what if you have something that is extremely glossy or has mirrors in it versus something that has like there was also a great presentation from the photo side of DT just a couple of weeks ago on shooting cars, automobiles, which are really shiny and reflective, and the lighting job on that is totally different than anything that you would do for shooting a sculpture or a vase or any kind of 3D system. So I think it actually kind of is a dream, and I hate to say that, but yeah, there's just so much more complexity when you add that dimensionality in there. For 2D, of course, you've got plenty of standards available, but there's also a conference coming up that I think is done by the Rijksmuseum, which is the 2D 3D conference, and I highly suggest attending that if you're really interested in looking at sort of 3D standards.
Yeah, I'll add a touch to that, and then we're going to probably have to end this. I mean, from my perspective, a lot of times it depends on the collection size. So if you have the task of digitizing tens of millions of items with limited staff over X amount of years, sometimes just making your imagery based on target data or targets or standards is probably the way to go, because you have to move through so much material. But if you kind of flip that around and you're in more of a museum environment where you're doing what we call kind of, I hate to use the word bespoke, but a very descriptive, curated, art-directed lighting for individual objects, it's a very different scenario. But I think it's time to kind of wrap this up and move over to our breakout sessions. Arnab, again, excellent, provocative presentation. Again, I think about this stuff all the time, so I'm glad you took the reins and started to tackle this, and I'm very interested to see what comes out of the breakout.